If you thought that the tight end position was hard to predict, did you have a chance to take a look at the Week 10 fantasy leaders at the wide receiver position? Ahead of Monday Night Football, the likes of John Mechie, Juwan Jennings, Ricky Pearsall, Rashad Bateman, Alec Pierce, Tylan Wallace, and yes, Marquez Valdez-Scantling were among the top 15, all producing more than 6 teams' fantasy points. Except for those 49ers pass catchers, there's a good chance that you're not starting any one of the above names there, even with the Cardinals, the Giants, the Buccaneers, and the Panthers all on buys this week. To help you avoid what is the waiver wire dumpster fire, here are your RotoBaller Week 11 starts and sits for the wide receiver position. Starting with George Pickens of the Pittsburgh Steelers as they take on the Baltimore Ravens. Pickens has now posted 20 plus fantasy points here in 2 of the last 3 games that he's played. Since week number 7, his 18 fantasy points per game, that has him right behind Justin Jefferson on a points per game basis. Usually I'm the guy who's hating on Pickens more than the rest of the consensus, and it's hard to argue with his recent success that has pushed him right to the top there when it comes to receiving yards with 639 in 9 contests. That success, it coincides with Russell Wilson taking over under center. Pickens has recorded at least 70 yards or more in 3 games with Wilson under center, seeing at least 5 targets in each game and recording a touchdown in 2 of those 3 contests. His only 2 touchdowns of the season, may I add. Pickens is set up for another big week this week against the Baltimore Ravens, a Ravens team that has allowed more fantasy points on a per game basis, 45.35, than any other team so far this season. The Ravens have also allowed more receiving yards, 1,992, and more receiving touchdowns, 16, to opposing wideouts than any other team that I mentioned. I mean, there's a reason why this team has given up more fantasy points to the wide receiver position than any other. Pickens, he is likely to end up as the wide receiver 1 overall this week, ahead of Jamar Chase and Justin Jefferson. Now, another wide receiver who could challenge for that crown, how about Kelvin Ridley of the Tennessee Titans versus the Minnesota Vikings? Now, let's crunch some numbers here, shall we? Since DeAndre Hopkins' departure, Kelvin Ridley has averaged 20.1 fantasy points per game. Now again, it's over a small 3-game sample size here, but he's done that with the odds stacked against him. And when I say odds, I mean Mason Rudolph in weeks 8 and 9 and Will Levis in week 10. If you can produce with those 2 quarterbacks, you're doing a pretty good job. Now, over his last 3 contests, Ridley has produced 300 receiving yards, 20 receptions, while being targeted on 32 occasions, including a 40.9% first read target share from Will Levis last week. The Titans offense has become a Ridley funnel. No Hopkins around, no problem. Ridley saw a 34% target share, so much for not forcing the ball to Kelvin Ridley. It's really fascinating. Let's talk about that target share post DeAndre Hopkins. 300 receiving yards, that is the second most in the NFL over that period. Ridley's 52.9% of the Titans' air yard share, that is the 3rd most, while the 20 receptions, that happens to be the 8th most. Last week, we thought the Chargers would be a difficult matchup. Turns out, that was a lie. This week, Ridley faces a Minnesota Vikings defense that has allowed 1,602 receiving yards and 11 touchdowns to the wide receiver position. Add that all up, that equals roughly 39.5 fantasy points per game, the 6th most. Now, I've never been one for math, but high volume plus a high chance of success often leads to big-time fantasy production, and that's what you're going to get from Kelvin Ridley this week. Another wide receiver poised for another big week. How about Cortland Sutton of the Denver Broncos as they take on the Atlanta Falcons? Let's keep the good times rolling, shall we, with another great matchup, at least on paper. As good as Ridley has been over the last 3 weeks, Cortland Sutton deserves a little bit of respect put on his name. Sutton's 19.8 fantasy points over that time period, that sits 7th, just behind Ridley, and he's produced at least 17 fantasy points in all 3 of those contests. Over those last 3 games, Sutton has gotten over 100 yards in 2 of those games and has accumulated 292 yards on 21 receptions. Last week, Sutton earned himself a 40.9% first read share, equal to Ridley's. Only 2 other receivers have accounted for an air yard share greater than 40%, a target share greater than 30%, along with 30 or more targets. Now, it's been a tale of 2 fantasy seasons for the Broncos pass catcher. Weeks 1 through 7, 21 catches, 277 yards, and 50.2 total fantasy points. In weeks 8 through 10, Sutton has 48.9 fantasy points, along with 21 receptions and 292 yards, along with a pair of scores. Look for that trend to continue this week against the Atlanta Falcons team, who have allowed 602 receiving yards and 4 touchdowns over the last 4 weeks. Those are the starts. Now, how about the sits? And I'm sitting DJ Moore of the Chicago Bears this week against the Green Bay Packers. Things, they have not been good in Chicago as of late. DJ Moore has not registered more than 7.5 fantasy points since way back in week number 5. Despite 40 receptions and 66 targets, he trails rookie Roma Dunze in receiving yards with 398, which is about 44.2 receiving yards per game. You can't trust that as a wide receiver 2. He's barely even a wide receiver 4 at this point. This week, it is not projected to be a bounce-back week by any means for Moore or this Bears passing game. This season, Green Bay, they have allowed just 1,182 receiving yards to opposing wide receivers. That is the 9th fewest. And over the last 4 weeks, only the Philadelphia Eagles have allowed fewer fantasy points to the position than the 20.4 per game conceded by the Packers. In those 4 weeks, the Packers have allowed just 31 receptions and 358 yards. Moving on, how about Jaylen Waddle? I'm at that point right now where I'm sitting Jaylen Waddle no matter what. I yearn for some positive consistency when it comes to my fantasy lineups, but I'm not getting that on a weekly basis out of Waddle. Before Monday Night Football and the conclusion of week number 10, Waddle sat as the wide receiver 66 in PPR scoring, having produced just one game with more than 9 fantasy points. How low is that bar set? That a perennial top 24 fantasy receivers prop bet is set at over under 44.5 receiving yards. Tua Tagovailoa, great matchup against the Rams. I mean, that should not be set that low. And you know what? First drive of the game, he comes out there, puts up 55 yards, hammers it over on that bet. But there is a clear pecking order in which Waddle happens to be the 3rd best option in this passing game behind Tyreek Hill and Devon Achane. Now, being the 3rd best option against a Raiders team that has allowed the 3rd fewest fantasy points per game, 21.88, over the last 4 weeks, that is far from promising. Las Vegas has allowed just 375 yards and a pair of scores to opposing wideouts over that time. Is that too small of a sample size? Well, how about this? Las Vegas has allowed just 27.31 fantasy points per game to the position over the course of the season. That is the 6th fewest, having allowed the 4th fewest receiving yards in just 9 games. And my final sit of the week, it is Michael Pittman Jr. of the Indianapolis Colts versus the New York Jets. The Michael Pittman era may be coming to an end for fantasy managers. We've been privileged to see Pittman at his best with Gardner Minshew under center, but the gunslinger, he's not coming back anytime soon. In fact, it doesn't seem to even matter if it's Anthony Richardson or Joe Flacco calling plays. It appears as though Pittman has become the 3rd option at best. Missing time due to a finger injury or back injury, that's not helping his cause either. One of those options ahead of Pittman happens to be Josh Downs, who is what we call quarterback friendly. With Steichen's commitment there to Flacco, it is essential to break down how Downs has become the go-to option for the veteran quarterback. In the 5 games Flacco has attempted 25 or more passes, Downs' target share has never dipped below 25% in any one of those games. With Pittman's stats for week number 11 still up in the air, it is hard to commit to him until we see him on the field and in action. As the injuries continue to add up and a potential displacement in this team's fantasy pecking order, Pittman can only be as trusted as a weekly fantasy flex option moving forward. If he were to return this week, not only is he competing with a potential Adonai Mitchell breakout, but he's also going to receive a significant challenge from Sauce Gardner and this Jets defense, a Jets defense that has been a fantasy graveyard for wide receivers, limiting opposing pass catchers to a league low 24.74 fantasy points per game this season. And if you want all the latest news and notes, head over to rotoballer.com or check me out in the RotoBaller Discord channel every single day of the week, 24/7. See you then.